Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be marking the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords that promised to bring in a new era of peace and reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians, but turned out to be a nightmare. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have an all-star cast on the Middle East Report today. I have Zalmi Unsdorfer, who is the chairman of Likud UK, together with my good friend Rabin Benson, who's a Christian supporter of Israel. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme as we mark 30 years of the signing of the Declaration of Principles, also known as the Oslo Accords. Zalmi, if I can ask you first, what is your memories of that historic day that took place on the 13th of September 1993 on the lawns of the White House, in which Bill Clinton sponsored that historic peace agreement between Israel and the PLO, and we saw Israel's Prime Minister then, Yitzhak Rabin, shake hands with his arch enemy, Yasser Arafat of the PLO?
Well, this came on the heels of the peace accords with Sadat that Menachem Begin, the Likud leader, previously had engineered, and obviously with Jordan. And it was felt that this was the next step. And if you could have peace with Egypt and Jordan, why couldn't you have it with the Palestinian leadership? And yeah, there was hope on everyone's side. Everybody wishes for peace. No one's tried more efforts to make peace with the Palestinian Arabs than Israel has, and keeps getting refused. So when this one wasn't refused, everyone had a great deal of hope. Trust, not quite sure, but hope, yes.
Yeah. And Rabin, it's great that you can join Zalmi for this particular program. Me personally, I remember being kind of 19 years old, and the Lord had just been giving me this tremendous love for Israel and the Jewish people. I was extremely, and I still am, extremely interested in kind of Israeli politics. And I remember the 13th of September very well, watching the TV news reports, looking at the front pages of the newspapers which I bought, the Times, the Telegraph, all carried this historic peace agreement that promised to usher in a new era of peace and reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. What are your thoughts going back 30 years to this historic agreement?
Well, I was a little bit older than you were, Simon. To be honest with you, Israel was not on my radar at that particular stage in my life. I was working at a Bible school up in the northwest of England. There were some connections with things to do with Israel, and I do vaguely remember the news footage watching that. But to be honest with you, I don't think it didn't mean that much, because I wasn't as immersed in the whole subject as I am now and have been, since I started working with Christian Friends of Israel back in 2003. So it probably was just, it was another item on that particular news program, and then that passed on into whatever came next, and that was it, to be truthful with you. Yeah. So yeah, that's my recollection.
Very good. And Zalmi, what's your recollection? Being a Jewish person of faith, knowing that what Israel was potentially going into was to actually give land for peace, giving away the biblical heartland of Israel, which is known as Judea and Samaria, to Israel's arch enemies in the hope for peace and recognition of the Jewish state.
Well, I mean, I've never been one for land for peace. Talk to the Indians in what used to be their Americas, and it's a bit like throwing continuously meat to a lion and expecting him to become a vegetarian. It just doesn't work that way in real life. But again, we come back to the word hope. Hatikva is Israel's anthem, and it's not just the Hatikva of the return of the Jewish people to their biblical homeland. It is to be able to live in peace in our homeland, which we haven't had a minute's peace. Israelis have not had a minute's peace since the birth of the state. And in fact, before the birth of the state, I mean, we had been there for hundreds and thousands of years, but certainly the Yishuv, the original settlement, the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah, that was, before the state. So, we've never had a minute's peace, and we'll do anything for peace, even give away parts of our biblical homeland. It turned out to be a busted flush, a damp squib, whatever we want to call it, and it cost us a lot in blood. But hopefully we would have learned some lessons from that. I'm not sure that all parts of Israeli society have learned the lessons of Oslo, and that land for peace is a complete illusion. Yeah. Now, with Iran, obviously at the time of the Oslo Accords, Iran was not such a great force in the world. With Iran now sponsoring proxies and a ring of fire around Israel, that's a whole different ballgame. And the idea of giving any land for peace is pure insanity, because every piece of land we've vacated has been turned into an Iranian rocket base.
Absolutely. So if we put this, the signing of the Declaration of Principles, or known as the Oslo Accords, in its historical context, we know that, for example, we see the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. We see the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91 that led America as the most dominant power or superpower in the world. We saw that in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we saw an international coalition assembled in the Middle East to actually push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. And from there we saw that that was successful, but we also saw, for example, that Yasser Arafat and the PLO decided to back Saddam Hussein, which meant that he became completely isolated from the rest of the Arab world, because part of that coalition against Saddam was the Syrians under Assad's regime, together with the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and other Arab Sunni nations fought in that war with Britain and America to liberate Kuwait. We see that the administration of George Bush pushed for the Madrid peace talks in '91 to find a final settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And from there we really see that it was the start of the peace process in the Middle East. What are your thoughts about the strategic dynamics that brought Israel and the PLO to the negotiating table to finally thrash through a deal known as the Oslo Accords back in the 13th of September 1993?
Well, look, the architects were secular leftists who believed in this land for peace illusion. To them, giving up parts of the Israeli, the Jewish homeland doesn't mean anything. They would like to become members of the EU and become just a country made up of its people. And we've seen, in France and everywhere else, what's happened to this, the results of such a melting pot experiment. It doesn't work, and it eventually destroys nation states. So that whole idea, wasn't going to fly. I mentioned before that the Oslo Accords were predicated on the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan and so forth.
Sorry, the Jordan one came in '95.
Yes, but I mean the peace agreements are possible between countries. The problem with making peace with Arafat was he was not a country. He was just the leader of a band of terrorists who'd been, by that time, expelled to Tunisia. And this was his way of coming back and having a little state for himself. So for Arafat, I think it was, he never intended to renounce terror. The PLO charter was never changed, liquidate Israel. But if you just set aside all of the violence and the Second Intifada and all of these other things that followed from the Oslo Accords, the central thing was that the world powers who signed up to this and witnessed this agreement and said they would send money to a new nascent Palestinian authority, okay, stopped sending it because none of the rules of where this money was going to go to, because it needed to be audited and so forth, were kept by Arafat. He just turned it into his usual bank account, which is what Abbas is doing, and which is all the other Hamas billionaires. You know, Google Hamas billionaires and you'll read all about it, okay? It was the money. It's always usually comes down for these leadership, for the money. The foot soldiers, they go around killing people. The poor Palestinian street people are impoverished because of the corruption of their leaders. But for Arafat, it was a money-making machine. And then the world powers, the EU and so forth, stopped sending those funds. So the whole thing collapsed.
That's a good analysis. Thank you very much. And Robin, also comes a time where we saw in 1992 the election of Yitzhak Rabin for a second time as the Israeli Prime Minister, offering a kind of new hope for Israel, kind of land for peace. We also see that was then followed by the surprise presidential victory of Bill Clinton against George Bush, promising that he wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted one big foreign policy achievement under his belt. And therefore we saw that strong relationship develop between Clinton and Rabin. Share with us how important that would have been to the signing of the Declaration of Principles or the Oslo Accords.
You have Rabin's predecessor, Shamir, who was against making agreements with any terrorist entity. You know, as Zalmi has already pointed out, was part of that part of Israeli society that didn't want to give away land for peace. And so Rabin comes in with this different attitude, polar opposite attitude, and as Zalmi has rightly pointed out, willing to almost give away anything in order to try and create a peaceful situation in a troubled part of the world. And as again Zalmi has pointed out so well, Israel has faced conflict from the moment it was reconstituted as a nation state in 1948. And as you say, Simon, then Bill Clinton appears on the scene. And like any new American president, especially someone who comes in as a surprise, unexpected in some senses, he's wanting to make a name for himself on the international stage. And with the changes, therefore, in Israeli governance and the change to a democratic presidential candidate and successor, you have, I suppose, the impetus to try and move things forward on the basis of the other negotiations that have been going on, with Egypt and might have been going on with Jordan in the background, unbeknownst to most folk. And so you have the catalyst to create this agreement that was hailed on, the rose lawn of the White House in front of this crowd. I mean, if you look at some of the footage, it's name after name after name of American politicians and diplomats and other nations represented as well, who are all supposedly getting behind this agreement to push it forward and to see the beginnings, because it was only laying a foundation. It was not a peace treaty. It was a 5-year agreement that was supposed to then bring about a final peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. But it was supposed to be the grand starter with all of the ripple effects, positive ripple effects that there were supposed to be for Palestinian Arab society, again, that as Zalmi has pointed out, have never, ever come about in the nearly 30 years since the jolly thing was signed. And poor Mr. Rabin or was it Shimon Peres, sort of forced into shaking Arafat. I mean, you could see his hesitation as Bill Clinton sort of, almost grabbed hold of his hand and stuck it into Arafat's hand. I mean, that is one of the scenes that I remember most from that incident, the obvious discomfort that the Israeli leader had in even doing that. And that should have told the world how awkward this so-called beginnings of peace actually was. And should have been a warning sign of what was to come.
Yep. And by contrast, look at the warm relationship between Begin and Sadat.
Yeah.
That was the complete opposite.
Yes, and unfortunately.
Because you look into Arafat's eyes and he's the one who kills babies in the Ma'alot massacre of the Ma'alot kindergarten. The guy was an absolute father of terrorism, godfather of terrorism. That never changed, and I don't think anyone expected him to change.
Yeah, and himself, Arafat later openly acknowledged that it was, how do you pronounce it? Hudna, which was a temporary agreement in order to facilitate the PLO and the PA's aims of the destruction of Israel. So it was just making time for their long-term aim, which has never changed.
And he made that speech, I think, in a mosque in South Africa in 1994. Yeah. So even laid out his credentials, even as far back as then. Let's have a look and take a step back 30 years to look at this moment in history when Israel and the PLO signed the historic Declaration of Principles known as the Oslo Accords.
September 13th, 1993 was hailed as an historic day when Israel and the Palestinians would begin to put their differences aside.
Enough of blood and tears. Enough!
The concept seemed simple enough. Israel would give up West Bank territories it won in the 1967 Six-Day War, while the Palestinians would recognize Israel and get their own state. And the two peoples could live side by side in peace and security. But a Palestinian Authority government mired in corruption had different ideas, and through the 90s, terrorist groups increased their campaign against Israelis. Also, just 2 years after the White House ceremony, Rabin was murdered by an Israeli gunman. The peace process moved forward anyway, and President Clinton almost brokered a deal at Camp David in which the Israelis would give up most of the West Bank and part of Jerusalem. But Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat rejected the U.S. brokered agreement, and the result was a second intifada and a wave of terror attacks, leading to more than 2,000 dead on both sides. Former Palestinian negotiator Ahmed Correa says Israel is at fault.
I blame the Israeli leaders for two reasons. One, they have the power. Second, they are the occupier. And they want the Palestinian everything in their pocket, and they want to take more from the empty pocket of the Palestinians.
Under pressure from the West, the peace process continued, but the Bush administration departed from past U.S. policy and refused to deal with Arafat, seeing him as part of the problem rather than the solution. With Mahmoud Abbas in power after Arafat's death, the Israelis under Ariel Sharon pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, uprooting more than 8,000 Jewish residents from their homes. They hoped it would lead to peace. Instead, it led to elections favoring the radical Hamas, an eventual Hamas dictatorship in Gaza, and thousands of rocket attacks on a growing number of Israeli cities. By this time, many Israelis had begun to realize that their concessions weren't leading to peace.
Enough with giving land, enough with concessions, enough with President Obama telling us, go back to the 67 lines. We will not do it. We will not get out from our homeland. We will build in Judea and Samaria.
This spring, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry tried to jumpstart talks between the Palestinian Authority and the Netanyahu government. But in September, as Israelis marked their holiest day of the year with signs of war all around them, the promise of Oslo seems like a distant memory. John Wagi, CBN News.
And that CBN video is 10 years old, came out in 2013. We're now 10 years on and 30 years on from that historic peace agreement that promised peace but delivered war. Zalmi, the big question is, and many scholars and academics have been asking this question, why did Yitzhak Rabin make peace with Yasser Arafat when Arafat and the PLO were completely isolated in Tunisia? They were running out of money. They were losing support in the Arab world because of Arafat's backing of Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War. And yet here, Rabin and Clinton actually give Arafat a get-out-of-jail card. And they elevate him onto the world stage as a statesman, sign an historic agreement with him, but knowing his terrorism credentials, the question is, why didn't Israel deal with the indigenous leadership in Judea and Samaria amongst the Arabs and have a completely separate agreement rather than bringing the PLO in right on Israel's border into the biblical heartland of Israel to endanger Israel?
First of all, as Robin says, United's new president wants to create a legacy. In the case of Clinton, it was this. In the case of Obama, it was the Iran deal, which Obama's holdovers in the Biden administration are still trying to push. Is there any logic in empowering the greatest terrorist state on the planet? No. Is there any logic in empowering a terrorist that's been exiled to Tunisia, where the Israelis had literally put him in a box there? There isn't. But unfortunately, political ends and political aspirations trump that. And as far as, and you'll forgive the pun, because if Trump would have come in now, the Iranians, the mullahs wouldn't have lasted three more months under his sanctions. So there is no real sense in that. It's all about, a domestic agenda and having a legacy achievement. And we all know. I think we all. Most Israelis knew that Arafat was not to be trusted. He was a murderer. He was not going to turn from a wolf into a sheep. And it's unfortunately an experiment that went wrong, but we keep making the same mistakes again and again. You mentioned that the video that you just showed was 10 years old. I ask you, is there any difference 10 years ago in what was going on, with the missile attacks from Gaza and all the terrorism to now? No. Is there any difference now with empowering Iran and empowering Arafat? No. We just keep doing the same insanity, which is Einstein saying insanity is repeating the same thing, expecting different results.
No, exactly. And tell us, Robin, we see particularly with the PLO, for example, as Zalmi was saying, that this is a kind of terrorist organization. They were set up by President Nasser of Egypt in the late 1960s. On its covenant charter, the PLO's covenant charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. And surely the Israelis would have actually known, or the government known, the risk that they were taking, particularly Yitzhak Rabin, who was famously the chief of staff of the IDF, a war hero in Israel's War of Independence, and someone that the Israelis looked up to, respected and trusted.
Well, I think you hit it on the nail. It's because of who he was that he was able to sell it to the Israeli public. I mean, in the end, I suppose Israel got to the point where it had to deal with someone if it wanted to be seen to try and settle this ongoing conflict that had been going on for decades, and the destruction, the loss of life on both sides that had been going on. And Arafat was the guy. For whatever reasons, he was the chosen head of this, at that point, major Palestinian representative organization. But I listen to what Zalmi says, and I feel exactly the same way he does. It boggles the mind how anyone can sit down with someone like Arafat and the other representatives of his organization and really believe anything that they're going to say to you is the truth. And history has proven since 1993 that nothing that Arafat and the PLO committed themselves to, they have kept. Every item, every major factor in both the Oslo Accords, they have broken. But then they blame Israel for breaking it, when they themselves are the ones who are first and foremost at the top of the list in breaking the agreements. I don't know, it just beggars belief that the Israelis could actually believe that something good could come from it. And maybe it's a case of, political hype just takes over, and human beings that want, in inverted commas, to think the best of the other sincerely believe that giving the Palestinian Authority a certain amount of authority by the promises of economic investment and development that went along with that actually might change the hearts and minds of a high percentage of the Palestinian Arab population, who then, as now, want to see the annihilation of every Jewish person at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea and the destruction of the Jewish state. That's where they were. 30 years later, they're in exactly the same place, except, as Zalmi has pointed out, Iran is now the octopus that is controlling all the other terrorist entities like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, these new groups that are cropping up all over Judea and Samaria, and even within Israel proper itself. There is the fear now of Iran having sleeper cells that are just waiting to be awakened. And actually, terrorism has exponentially expanded as a result of these agreements. That's been the net result. More terrorism, not less.
No, to your point about why Arafat and why did they bring him back out of exile, I think Clinton and his advisors knew that whoever else they're going to make an accommodation with to get this legacy peace deal going, if Arafat was outside the tent, he would be fomenting trouble on an ongoing basis. And the whole, whatever peace agreement they had dreamed of would quickly be scuttled with an outbreak of terror. In fact, the second intifada would probably have come a lot sooner than it did.
Yeah. So, Zalmi, we know that in Israeli history and Israeli politics, Yitzhak Rabin was considered a kind of warrior prime minister. He was involved in, courageously fought in Israel's War of Independence. There's a famous story whereby he helped to smuggle many of the Jewish immigrants that had come in during the Mandate years after the Second World War into the Athlete camp, which if any of you have been to, you should go and visit in northern Israel, in Akko, and actually managed to get loads of the Jewish immigrants to escape. Him and some soldiers of the Palmar hid inside a gymnasium, and when it was night they got them all free and then dispersed them, about 200. So the figures were huge. So he also played a major role in Israel's War of Independence. I think played some role in Israel's Suez crisis in 56. He was ill for 67, but known as a safe pair of hands. So do you think how much the actual Oslo Accords was part of his legacy, saying that he's defended Israel in Israel's major wars, and now he's at old age, he wants to see Israel in peace? How much did that play as part of his ego, together with that of Shimon Peres, believing that both of them could bring Israel into a new era of peace? And just share with us what type of man you thought that Yitzhak Rabin was.
Well, Shimon Peres was always the dreamer, and all his books are about dreams, the new Middle East and so forth. And whilst very well intentioned, I think he was very much detached from reality. But we owe him a great deal of debt in terms of his service to Israel. He created the Dimona nuclear reactor, and he achieved great things for Israel. But he was not like Rabin, and they were constantly at odds with each other. And Rabin used to call Shimon Peres an inveterate plotter and schemer. On the other hand, Rabin, yes, a decorated soldier, a man who has served his country immeasurably, both in war and in diplomacy. He was the American ambassador, Israeli ambassador to the United States. Not an easy job, not in particularly that time as well. And he's the guy who ordered the rescue of the Entebbe hijack. So he's had a very storied life, and that was his moment. Unfortunately, he is associated. His memory is associated with Oslo, which is a stain, on a terrific and glittering career. And of course, his sad ending is again a stain on Israel, but it does go to show the strength of feeling that there was about giving away land to terrorists.
So let's have a look now at this excellent CBN news report that looks at the legacy of the late Yitzhak Rabin, who actually signed the Oslo Accords back on the 13th of September 1993.
Saturday evening, November 4th, 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had just sung Shir LaShalom, the song for peace, along with some 100,000 Israelis in Tel Aviv.
He was a man of the left who was respected on the right. He was a man who was cautious, who made bold decisions.
Shortly afterward, a Jewish extremist gunned down the prime minister.
It was not just a political assassination, it was the murder of a hero and a grandfather.
Rabin is buried here in Mount Herzl Cemetery in Jerusalem. Many Israelis come here to honor his legacy. His murder stunned the nation and the world. Leaders from some 40 countries traveled here to Jerusalem for Rabin's funeral.
Though we no longer hear his deep and booming voice, it is he who has brought us together again here, in word and deed, for peace.
A few years earlier, Rabin told CBN founder Pat Robertson Israel must remain strong in the face of threats.
Does it seem as if Syria, possibly any of the other Arab states, might want to move into some kind of a jihad against Jerusalem, against Israel, or is that likely?
I was born here in Jerusalem. I fought in the two wars that decided the fate of Jerusalem to become the capital of the state of Israel. And I believe that they'll never be able to fulfill what they try to achieve as long as we'll keep our powder dry, our belief unshaken, and we'll have the patience to do what our heritage, religion call us to do.
Michael Widlansky, author of Battle for Our Minds, says the problems of today closely resemble those from decades ago.
Some of the world's leaders don't interpret events correctly. Rabin was genuinely loved in Israel, but even at the time of his death, many Israelis thought that his bold action towards peace was a mistake.
In 1993, Rabin and PLO chairman Yasser Arafat's representatives signed the Declaration of Principles in the presence of U.S. President Bill Clinton on the White House lawn.
The agreement with the Palestine Liberation Organization did several things. First of all, it saved the Palestine Liberation Organization. The second thing is it brought in an era of terror unmatched in Israel's history. And the third thing is it taught Israelis that to build peace required more than just hoping for peace. It meant building security.
In 1975, 18 years before Prime Minister Rabin shook Arafat's hand, he told Robertson that while superpowers could play a role in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, they could not replace the parties themselves.
Any peace negotiations have to start on the assumption that the purpose of the exercise, the purpose of the negotiations, is to make peace. And to make peace between whom? Between the Arab countries and Israel.
Prime Minister, if the Arab countries are not truly willing to accept peace negotiations with Israel, do you feel that the efforts of the superpowers, either the United States or Russia, will bring anything good towards peace?
I think that the major powers can create conditions, can create the environment that would lead the Arab countries on one hand and Israel on the other hand to make peace. But the peacemaking is the responsibility of the parties to the conflict.
In 1979, Israel signed its first peace treaty with Egypt, and in 1994, its second treaty with Jordan. Both agreements have held for decades, despite ups and downs.
The peace agreements that Israel made proved several things. First, Israel wants peace. Secondly, Israel can make peace with real countries when there are real joint interests. But third, Israel should not try to make peace with make-believe organizations of make-believe minorities, with make-believe national movements.
During a rally marking the 20th anniversary, former President Bill Clinton urged Israelis to finish Rabin's legacy of refusing to give up his peace dream, even in the face of terror.
Whenever there was a terrible incident here and I would call him, he simply repeated what we in the White House came to know as Rabin's Law. We will fight terror as if there were no negotiations, but we will negotiate as if there were no terror.
But Widlansky says if Rabin were alive today, he would likely rethink the so-called Rabin's Law.
I think he would be very disappointed with his own endeavor and would say Israel has to rely upon itself, upon God, and upon its own better judgment to survive and to thrive.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Mount Herzl Cemetery, Jerusalem.
And there we go, a great tribute to Yitzhak Rabin, former Prime Minister of Israel twice. He heroically rescued Israelis caught up in the Entebbe raid, and we all know about that incredible raid in Entebbe in Uganda. He was the Prime Minister that oversaw that, but sadly, whether it was the influence of Shimon Peres or the influence of Clinton, made a huge strategic mistake in signing the Oslo Accords. Robin, when we look at that video and we look back to 30 years ago, this was only Israel's second ever so-called peace agreement. Prior to that in 1979, we saw how Menachem Begin made that courageous peace with Anwar Sadat in Egypt, and it was a different peace. Firstly, it was a warm peace. It started off as a warm peace that we had Anwar Sadat visit Jerusalem. He made a personal speech to the Knesset and to the Israeli people, saying how there has to be peace, and that Israel surrendered the Sinai, which was a buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. But here in this agreement, Israel was signing an agreement with a known terrorist with blood on his hands, responsible for the death of hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelis, knowing that he may have not, this leopard may not have changed his spots, and also knowing that there was a danger of bringing Arafat right next to Israel's border into the biblical heartland of Israel and disrupting then the Arab Palestinian population living there as well. So surely these risks were actually calculated, or would like to think so, 30 years ago by Rabin.
I would like to think so, that the risks were calculated. I'm sure there's documentation somewhere in the archives that might prove that. But as Zalmi has pointed out already, the willingness to take the risks, the willingness to try and, how shall we put it, think the best, as I said previously, of the other, has proven decade after decade, year after year, almost month after month, to be you used the expression, a busted flush, useless, in other words. And what happened was that Israel brought Arafat, with all of his coterie of advisors and all the rest of it, in and imposed him on the Arab Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza initially, until Hamas kicked them out. And look where that has left them, an impoverished people in both areas, more so in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. It has left them as a people who have to contend with security checks that nobody wants, but are necessary in order to protect Israeli citizens, totally necessary. Because before them, Israeli citizens were being massacred by the dozen, if not the hundreds. It has left them impoverished, and again, as Zalmi's pointed out earlier in the program, but with a bunch of guys up at the top who have salted away millions in foreign bank accounts.
Billions, I think.
Billions over the decades. And yet they come begging year after year after year to the international community, give us more, we're about to run out. I mean, I think it's almost on a monthly basis now, we get headlines, the Palestinian Authority is on the verge of financial collapse. And then somebody pours some more money in and everything's fine, but it gets salted away. It doesn't filter down through to the people. And worst of all, above everything else, is that it has left Israel with terrorist cells scattered the length and the breadth of certainly areas A and B, so-called, of Judea and Samaria, and of course Gaza, which is just a hotbed waiting for the next barrage of rockets. And now, it's clear there are cells of terrorist entities in Israel proper. Arabs who are sympathetic to Iran, Arabs who are sympathetic to the extremist Islamist terrorist organizations that are setting up stall and gradually taking over the Palestinian Authority's towns and cities. I mean, the reality is that if it wasn't for Israel, Mahmoud Abbas wouldn't exist.
Correct.
As the president of the Palestinian Authority. It's Israel who keeps him in power, because it's Israel who's providing the security that keeps him so. So the whole thing is just, it's a facade of so-called attempts to bring reconciliation and peace to a people who, for the majority, don't want peace. They want destruction.
Absolutely. And the big question mark is whether Abbas actually wants a Palestinian state because of the responsibility that goes with having a state in the first place. But Zalmi, a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I came across a very interesting document relating to the Oslo Accords. And this was a document that was translated from Hebrew into English, and effectively said that the Oslo Accords were designed as a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, pull the IDF, everyone out, including that of Gaza, but wrap it up and sell it to the Israeli people as a peace process. But effectively, it was a unilateral withdrawal from the Palestinian territory. It was a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, which then later became the Palestinian Authority. What are your thoughts on what is probably the real intention behind the Oslo Accords?
Well, clearly, it's impossible to police, all those Arabs living in Judea and Samaria. When we had been thrown out of the country, the Romans, the Babylonians, history is replete with that. And these guys, came in with the creation of the state and started farming agricultural land. They only came back because the Israelis came. The Jews came back to farm the land. And that's where they got jobs. So they came down from Syria and they became Palestinians. I think, to Robin's last point about, none of them wanting peace, I believe 90% of the Palestinian Arabs living in Judea and Samaria would be very happy to have peace. Just like the 1.8 million or so Israeli Arabs who have the greatest rights of Arabs in any part of the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Is in Israel, okay? It's the leadership which has always been corrupt. And the leadership was first corrupted by money, now it's corrupted by Iran, who wants to liquidate Israel. So as far as, going back to your question, yes, it was a question of, well, if you can govern yourselves and have your own people looking after security, fine. But they never did look after their security. In fact, there was a revolving door. If a terrorist was caught by the Palestinian police, he was out the next day. I think that's a little bit about what's going on in New York today. but it's a revolving door, and we are where we are now.
Yeah, and Robin, share with us really, the first agreement, so we had the signing of the Oslo Accords known as the Declaration of Principles, and that the Israeli government would recognize the PLO as the sole representatives of the Palestinian people, because then before the PLO was considered a terror organization, stands for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Then we saw in, I think it was the summer of 1994, something known as the Jericho-Gaza Agreement. The Israelis offered Arafat control of Gaza. He said no. He didn't want Gaza, so they gave him Jericho as a sweetener, and this started the unilateral withdrawal of the IDF from these ancient biblical cities to hand them over to that of Arafat and the PLO. And then it seems that what Arafat did with that was to create a terrorist entity. And this is when we saw the first wave of suicide bombings happen by Hamas. And the first one happened on the 13th of April, 1994, where 5 people were killed in a suicide bombing attack on a bus in the central bus station of Hadera, and Hamas claimed responsibility. Share with us how Israel gave land, but in return got terrorism.
But this has been the repeating pattern. Down through all of these agreements with PLO and the various entities that are either connected to it or which are actually vying to take over its position within the control, the management, the administration of the Palestinian Arab population. This has been the repeating pattern. And as Zalmi has pointed out, eventually the Israeli people, the Jewish population, realized that giving away land for peace was not going to work. And we have seen a shift, have we not, in the whole political atmosphere in Israel moving either to a center-right or a right viewpoint, which includes no more land given away for peace. Because, from our perspective, you and mine, Simon, as Bible-believing Christians, that's no disrespect to you, Zalmi, but we see in the Word of God that God says you're not to divide your land, you're not to give it away. And the giving away by successive Israeli governments, in this time frame of biblical heartland, Jericho, Shechem, the whole issue of who has the rights to Hebron and everything associated with that, Bethlehem, Nazareth, all of these key major biblical cities have been given into the hands of the Palestinians.
Half of Nazareth hasn't, thankfully.
I beg your pardon. Okay, all right, sorry, not Nazareth. Okay, have been given into the hands of the Palestinian Authority, and many of them have become hotbeds of terrorist activity. And Israel, blessed, is reaping the consequences of well-meaning, humanistic thinking politicians who don't grasp the biblical realities that the current government and its coalition partners do for all of the other problems that we may see arise out of that ongoing political, relationship at the present time. So you pay the price of compromise, and the price of compromise, sadly, has been destruction and the loss of hundreds of lives on both sides of the conflict.
Yeah, and I suppose if we look, we have less than 10 minutes of the programme left, Zalmi. I think if we look at the legacy of the signing of the Oslo Accords back in 1993, it would have been Yasser Arafat polluting the minds of innocent children with a hatred for Israel, an incitement of terrorism and a glorification of terrorism that dominated the Palestinian media and its education system, creating a Palestinian terrorist network. And of course, we saw this explode after the Camp David Accords, where Israel's Prime Minister then, Ehud Barak, effectively gave Arafat a Palestinian state, half of the old city of Jerusalem as a future capital of a Palestinian state. And this is the biggest offer of land for peace that Israel has ever given the Palestinian Arabs. And return, Arafat launched the Second Intifada, Israel's most horrific war, in my opinion, of suicide bombings going off on buses, cafes, a shopping mall, just an absolutely horrific time. Share with us your legacy, what you think the legacy is of the Oslo Accords.
I think we just have to follow the scripture. I think we have to, we read the portions of the Torah every Saturday in the synagogue. Last week, we read the part of the journeys of the Jewish people before they go into the land of Israel. And there's a verse there that says, and it'll be familiar to you, and maybe to you too, make sure that you drive the people out of the land, because if you allow them to stay in the land, they will become pins in your eyes and thorns in your sides. So it's not that we're not driving them out of the land, we're actually bringing them back into the land. We brought Arafat out of Tunis and back into the center of Judea and Samaria. The other day, you talked about giving up parts of Jerusalem and 97% of them, of the West Bank. Somebody sent me a video 2 days ago of Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, admitting that he offered Arafat, he offered Abbas, the Western Wall.
Oh, well.
Okay, if you think there are riots now in Israel over judicial reform, giving away the Western, but he was prepared to do that. And the lesson, you ask me what it is, I'll tell you what the lesson is, that the Lord of Israel does not slumber nor sleep, and he is protecting our people from the folly of our leaders. and has done this time and time again. Yeah. We've made so many mistakes, and we're still here. May he just continue protecting us.
Amen to that.
So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report that really effectively looks at the legacy of the Oslo Accords 30 years on. And this one is called Palestinian Leaders Inciting Violence Against Israel.
Israel's Iron Dome defense system knocked down the missile, and the military retaliated by taking out a Hamas weapons manufacturing site. While no group claimed responsibility for the rocket attack, Israel holds Hamas responsible for what happens inside Gaza. The confrontation follows weeks of terror attacks inside Israel that's left 14 dead, dozens wounded, and days of rioting on the Temple Mount. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett accused Hamas of inciting the violence.
There are those who are encouraging rock throwing and the use of violence against the citizens of the State of Israel. This is a reward for the inciters, especially Hamas, which are trying to ignite violence in Jerusalem.
Itamar Marcus of the Palestinian Media Watch told CBN News back in February, PA leaders called for popular resistance.
Now, what does that mean? That means that all the PLO leadership, all the PA leadership are calling for violence of individuals with knives, with guns, and especially focused on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is coming from the top.
Marcus says Palestinian Authority leaders, like the top Islamic advisor to PA President Mahmoud Abbas, have called for religious violence during Ramadan. He said Ramadan is not a month of laziness, but rather a month of activity, of effort, and of hard work. And as it also was in the life of the Prophet, a month of jihad, conquest, and victory. For the first time in decades, the Muslim month of Ramadan, the Jewish Passover, and the Christian celebration of Easter have come at the same time. During Passover, Jews have been attacked in the Old City. Palestinians have thrown rocks at buses carrying Jews to the Western Wall, and stockpiled stones on the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque has been the epicenter of clashes with Israeli police. On the official PA TV prayer for Ramadan, an imam declared, Allah, liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque from the defilement of the evil Jews.
Palestinians are a very religious people. Ramadan is the most important month of the year. When Palestinians hear this, they feel that in order to be a good Muslim, they've got to attack Israelis, supposedly in defense of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is all something that's happening from the top. Palestinians wouldn't be collecting stones if they weren't being directed from their leadership to do this.
Marcus says the West needs to know what's behind the current wave of violence. He says it's not a spontaneous uprising, but orchestrated violence by the Palestinian Authority. Gordon?
Well, Chris, tell us how Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are working together on these attacks.
Well, I think you could say, actually, in one sense, they are working together because they're both trying to commit violence against Jews. But on the other hand, Gordon, they're competing to see who can be more violent against Israel. They're rivals, and they're both trying to capture the hearts and minds of Palestinians. So they're both inciting terror against Israelis and Jews. You know, Gordon, in a normal country, leaders would be competing to see who could bring peace. But after years of incitement by the PA against Israel and the commitment by Hamas to destroy Israel, the way to become successful in the Palestinian world is to have more, not less, terror. And Hamas also, Gordon, represents a serious threat to the PA. In fact, if elections were held now, more Palestinians support Hamas. They would win in any election. And that's why there's actually been no Palestinian election since 2006. And that's why Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is actually in the 16th year of his 4-year term.
Yeah.
So that news report was back in the spring of 2021, and effectively we should see that Palestinian leaders as Mahmoud Abbas and others should actually be arrested for incitement to genocide and also for indoctrinating their children with hatred and violence towards Israel and encouraging them into a life of terrorism and violence, which is nothing less than state child abuse. When we look at the legacy of the Oslo Accords, Robin. Prior to the Oslo Accords, we had Israelis would visit Jericho and have a coffee in Jericho, visit some of the Arab markets there as well. And also the Palestinian Arabs would also then visit Israel and work in Israel. A lot more did back then than they do today. So it's the legacy of actually the Oslo Accords has actually brought Israel and the Palestinian Arabs further apart than closer together.
As it stands today, yes. I mean, effectively, the Oslo Accords are dead. They're useless. They're of no value whatsoever. And okay, it's good that we recognise them 30 years on, but actually, as in the sense of furthering any solution, any bringing to a conclusion this 75-odd year, long conflict, they're useless, and it has made life difficult for both the Palestinian Arabs and for Israeli people. I mean, Israelis dare not go into Arab areas, particularly if you're driving an Israeli car, because the number plate system is different. You're immediately a driving target, as we've seen over and over again with these attacks on people just on public roads, amongst other things.
So Robin and Zalmi, thank you so much for being my guests on the Middle East Report as we've unpacked the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Principles known as the Oslo Accords that provided the framework for the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. And I want to thank you for watching this program at home. We can see for ourselves and from watching this program that the legacy of the Oslo Accords has brought violence, bloodshed and terror to the streets of Israel. And any future Israeli government needs to recognize that by offering land for peace, that Israel has got violence, and that the Palestinian Authority and leadership themselves are not committed to a genuine peace with Israel until they love their children more than they hate the Israeli children. There won't be peace. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.